On the next Probably True Solar Stories, a struggling vineyard owner installs solar, adopts a lost dog, and tries to make great wine. But nothing seems to be going well, and then something strange and wonderful happens that sparks joy in everyone, especially the dog. Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 5 of Probably True Solar Stories. I'm your Solar Story host, Tor Solarfred Valenza. If you're listening for the first time, thank you for joining our solar storytelling community. Our goal is to get solar into mainstream pop culture like cell phones, Taylor Swift, and the Real Housewives of New Jersey. Okay, maybe not New Jersey, but you get the point. With over 3.5 million solar installations and counting, solar is everywhere. So it should be on TV, film, music, books, art, but it's not. So I'm starting here on Probably True Solar Stories. In this episode, we're taking a break from classic solar noir, and we're traveling to a fairy tale vineyard located in Sonoma, California. So I hope you like wine, or at least dogs, or at least solar. In fact, as long as you're not driving, maybe pour yourself a glass of Zinfandel before you listen. This story is a kind of solar wine magical mystery tour. But rest assured, like all fairy tales, it does have a happy ending. Oh, and in case some little ones are listening with you, there is some mention of drug use here, so FYI. Okay, here we go. Bob, the Dog in the Solar Vineyard. Written and read by Tor Solarfred Valenza. Once upon a time, not long ago, in the land of Sonoma, there lived an old vineyard owner named Bob. Actually, let's not call Bob old. At 45, he just felt a bit tired, a bit lost, and a bit unloved. Okay, Bob was having a midlife crisis. Moving on. The 20-acre vineyard and resort that Bob had inherited from his family produced good wine, but it wasn't great. The food that the resort produced was agreeable, but not unique. And for the first time in 100 years, the vineyard and its wine-making facilities were losing money. As for love, Bob's relationship with his wife Marla was good after 20 years, but their passion was also meh. Bob still loved Marla. She had been a wonderful mother to their son, and she was a confident co-CEO for a 100-year-old family business that she had married into. Bob was grateful for all his blessings, and yet he felt hollow, like a bottle that had been mistakenly corked with half the wine. When Bob confessed to Marla about feeling half empty and worried about the vineyard's future, she knew what was missing: a dog. Since the age of 10, Bob had had at least one dog that had followed him everywhere around his family's vineyard. They had always bonded. Their last pup, Mabel, had recently passed on to the great grapevine in the sky after 15 years. Mabel loved car rides, walks following Bob through the vineyard, and Bob's gentle butt scratches. But Bob couldn't focus on a dog right now. His focus was on bringing the vineyard back to profitability. As part of that, they had decided to build a 1-megawatt solar project on 5 of the vineyard's 20 acres. Sadly for Bob, the solar was being installed on sacred family vineyard ground. The oldest part of the vineyard was closest to the utility infrastructure, and for that reason, it was the most cost-effective location for the new solar field. It was a sacrifice, but the alternatives were worse. Bob's accountants assured him that his solar investments would help keep the vineyard from falling deeper into debt. Otherwise, he could sell some land, but Bob was adamant about keeping the vineyard whole, even if that meant producing 5 acres worth of solar electrons instead of grapes. On the day that the installers scraped the old vineyard site, Bob drove his truck to the bare land. He'd walked and played there as a child. The change was striking. The sun beat down on the dark grayish-brown soil that was once shaded by rows of green Zinfandel vines. Discouraged, Bob turned towards his truck and caught the sight of a rooted vine with a single Zinfandel grape clutching firmly to its branch. The field was supposed to be clear of vegetation, but somehow this little Zin vine had survived. "Well, aren't you a hardy one?" said Bob. "I'm sorry, little guy." Tomorrow the installers were scheduled to plant the steel piles that would support solar trackers. Solar trackers used AI software to systematically and precisely point the solar panels towards the sun and generate as much solar as possible throughout the day. Knowing that the trackers needed as much space as possible, Bob should have picked up the vine and trashed it. Instead, Bob picked up the little vine and brought it to a corner of the cleared field. Then he bent down, dug a hole into the soil with his index finger, and replanted the little vine. Checking to see that none of the solar workers were watching, Bob kicked the ground, covering the little vine with a dusting of soil. He knew the vine wouldn't survive the solar construction, but it gave him comfort, knowing that this small but great and hardy Zin vine would be resting under the vineyard's new solar panels, perhaps as a short eulogy, or perhaps as a magical wish. Bob said, "Tell the solar panels to take care of us, little vine. We're counting on them." Then Bob inhaled the view of the sunset and went home to have dinner with Marla. What Bob didn't realize was that the hardy vine and its grape heard Bob's wish, and it dug deeper into the ground. Dun, la, 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 la. A year later, the solar construction was complete and began reducing the vineyard's substantial electricity costs. Feeling relieved, Bob could now focus on other projects. At the top of his list was finding a new vineyard dog. Bob collected Mabel's old leash, still hanging on the wall. Then he and Marla drove their pickup truck to the Sonoma County Animal Shelter. When the shelter manager heard that they lived on a vineyard, she led them to a solitary cage with a mostly black Australian shepherd. He'd been found wandering in another Sonoma Valley vineyard, but he had not been claimed in over a month. Like Bob, the Aussie was middle-aged, medium-sized, with black fur and flecks of white. Bob bent down to say hello, but the dog didn't put his paws on the door or whine like the other adoption dogs. Instead, he stayed quietly on his belly, his head resting on his front paws, stoically awaiting Bob and Marla's decision. A month ago, the Aussie had been sleeping on his old master's bed and heard whispering and his old name being mentioned several times. He did not know what the whispering meant, but on the next day, his masters had taken him for a car ride and stopped on a rural Sonoma road. He thought they were going for a pickup truck ride and a walk. But then his humans took off his leash and his collar, then they threw a ball across the road, and they drove away. The Aussie ran after the pickup truck, but finally gave up at the edge of the vineyard, tired, overheated, and thirsty. Eventually, the Aussie was picked up by the animal shelter. Though he had never bitten a man or even a cat, they put a muzzle on him and led him to a solitary cement cell with 2 meals and 2 walks a day. Looking at the new humans called Bob and Marla, the Australian shepherd doubted that they could be trusted. At any moment, they too could have late-night whispers and abandon him the next day on the side of the road, or worse, at a vineyard. Bob sensed that the Aussie dog was wounded. "I don't know," said Bob. "We'll take him," said Marla. "But we want a dog. He was found in a vineyard, and you need a project. He's perfect." Bob looked into the Aussie's eyes, and for some reason he remembered the lonely Zinfandel vine that he'd quietly replanted at the corner of his solar field. Okay, said Bob. "Let's call him Zin. Zin the Great." Marla nodded. "Zin the Great. What do you think, Zin?" asked Marla. The Aussie did not react. Now his name was Zin the Great. Fine. Before it had been Lucky. Clearly that name did not fit. Besides, He now knew that his name and these people could change again. In a month or a year, he could be called Cupcake or Dogzilla. It was best not to get excited about Zin the Great. When the adoption person opened the cage, Bob expected Zin the Great to leap and prance for joy, wagging his naturally bobbed Aussie shepherd tail. But Zin did not leap or prance or wag. He looked up at Bob and then at Marla, shook his thick mane of black fur, and then sat, waiting for his new masters to put on his collar and his leash. Then the day got worse. Upon arriving at his new home, Zin saw the bunches of grapes hanging off a vine. Once again, Zin had to accept his fate. They would abandon him. His name and his home would change again. He was sure of it. So he vowed he would not allow himself to feel attached to Bob, Marla, their home, or the land. Zin jumped out of the truck and marked a tree, but not for possession. He just had to go. Bob's previous vineyard dogs had been constant, lively companions. They followed Bob around the vineyard, digging up voles, fetching balls, and at night sleeping comfortably below Bob's feet on their king-sized bed. Zin was different. He didn't seem to enjoy walks, dog can openings, or table scraps. Privately, Zin did like balls. But what if Bob threw the ball into the vineyard across the road and ran away? He would not fall for that trick again. So as hard as it was not to chase after them, Zin let Bob's balls and rubber Kong toys fall, bounce, and break windows. Trying to win his trust, Bob massaged Zin's ears and scratched Zin's butt. At night, Bob encouraged Zin to sleep on their king-sized bed, but Zin kept to his dog bed. He would not allow himself to be attached to Bob or Marla. He commanded his stubby tail not to wag or show joy. After a year of spoiling, bribing, and pampering, it seemed to Bob that Zin the Great had no desire to be man's best friend, and certainly not Bob's best friend. Although the solar had substantially decreased the vineyard's utility expenses, sales remained flat. Feeling defeated, Bob decided that it was time to take a little trip. He walked into his office, opened an old storage trunk, and found his trip jar. Bob's trip jar was actually an empty almond butter jar that Bob had kept from college. Since then, it had been filled with a colorful mix of LSD-laced mints. With the right mint, Bob could take a vacation to someplace warm and friendly. It was like visiting Maui, but with unicorns. If Bob recalled, the white mints were laced with microdoses, the yellow mints were laced with macrodoses, and the blue mints were just plain mints. Or were the blue mints macrodoses and the yellow mints micro, and Bob couldn't remember. He just wanted a little, happy, warm, and cozy trip. But was that trip blue, yellow, or white? Bob thought about it. He looked at Zin the Great. As usual, Zin had no opinion. He could ask Marla, but instead, Bob closed his eyes and dipped his hand into the jar. He pulled out a yellow mint that was stuck to a blue mint and popped the fused double trip into his mouth without opening his eyes. As they melted, he felt the sharp sting of spearmint, and he knew what he had done. Oops! But it was too late. Bob felt hot and opened his eyes. From Zin's perspective, Bob seemed aloof. Clearly, this was the day. It was the abandonment trip. Fine, onward, thought Zin. Let's do this. From Bob's perspective, Zin the Great was now sitting in front of him. Though he knew he shouldn't, Bob felt like taking a drive. And for once, Zin seemed like he wanted to go with him. "Want to go for a ride?" Bob asked. And to Bob's surprise, Zin said in perfect English, "Sure, Bob. Let's go for a ride." Bob leaped for joy and ran to the wall for Zin's leash. In the hours that followed, Bob imagined driving on a yellow brick road and sticking his head out of his truck's window. Somehow Zin had learned how to drive. One paw was on the steering wheel, and one paw was on the door's open window ledge. They were listening to harmonious music, and it sounded something like la 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 la. Along the way, Bob saw billboard signs that said things like, "Bob, be patient, all is well." Another sign said, "The wine will be great." Another sign said, "Zin will love you." These were great signs. Bob pulled his head from out of the window to look at Zin the Great behind the steering wheel. But Zin had disappeared. No one was driving. Immediately, Bob's calm, wind in his hair feeling switched to panic as the truck abruptly went off the road. Miraculously, Bob was thrown out of his truck and landed softly on an Adirondack chair on his bedroom balcony. It was sunset, and Bob felt joy overlooking his family's 20 acres. Yes, 5 of the acres had solar on them now, but the vineyard was still whole. Like the first billboard said, all was well. An immense cathartic feeling of bliss inspired Bob to have an aha life-changing thought. Then Bob lost the thought. Then Bob remembered it again, and he wrote it down on an empty wine bottle. Then he lost the thought and the wine bottle. Panicking, Bob searched the balcony. Sadly, it was Bob's foot that found the wine bottle and kicked it over the balcony's edge. Bob ran to the balcony's railing. Unable to speak, he saw his life-changing thought on a wine bottle shatter into Humpty Dumpty pieces that all the king's men and all the king's horses could not put back together again. Frustrated, Bob started to cry, but then he heard Zin bark. Bob levitated, and he floated off the balcony and flew above his vineyard, searching for the bark that came from Zin the Great. Bob spotted Zin sitting exactly where he had secretly replanted the little hardy vine. The little vine had somehow survived, and it was wrapped around one of the solar tracker's piles. Purplish red Zinfandel grapes sprouted from the vine. Zin the Great did not know why, but he thought that he should eat one of those grapes, and so he did. The taste was not meat, but for some reason it was delicious, and it made him feel light. Seeing Zin sitting where he had replanted the little hardy vine made Bob smile. He made 3 breaststrokes through the air and then floated down, landing cross-legged in front of Zin. "I heard you bark," said Bob. "What's up?" The grape's light, sweet taste made Zin feel warm and protected. He was ready to meet his fate. "This is where you let me go and abandon me," said Zin in perfect English to Bob. "I am ready." Bob was more confused by Zin's words than Zin speaking English. "No, Zin, I would never abandon you. You're part of our vineyard now, just like the land, and just like the vines, and just like these solar panels. Everything around us, it's all part of you. It's all part of me." Bob knew the LSD was talking, but he felt somehow that this was true. "I'm sorry I haven't been able to get your tail wagging again, but believe me, I'm doing my best to keep us all together, to keep us whole. We love you, Zin, and we'd never abandon you. This is your forever home, I promise." Bob hugged Zin, and for the first time, Zin allowed himself to feel Bob's loyalty and love. As Bob stroked his fur and gave his butt a butt scratch, Zin couldn't stop his stubby tail from wagging contentedly. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to the land, to the vineyard, and to Bob. When he understood this, Zin's paws tingled. They dug into the vineyard's earth, and then he rolled over, giving himself a vineyard dust bath. He felt energy, and then he felt, or rather he heard, a dog-only sound frequency. It emanated from the solar array's inverters. Zin listened to the inverters. They told him that they were like solar energy translators. And now they wanted him to translate a message from the solar panels to Bob. Zin listened, and after he understood the solar panel's message, he turned to Bob. "Bob," said Zin, "the solar panels told me to tell you that the vine and the solar panels are one." "The vine and the solar panels are one?" repeated Bob. "But Zin, solar panels can't talk." "Neither can dogs," said Zin. "But hey, look at me." Zin's mouth broadened into a doggy panting smile, which made Bob smile, and then Bob burped with a sour but minty breath, and then he passed out. La 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 la, oh, oh, la 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 la. Bob woke up with a start. It was morning, and he was naked and leaning against the steel pile of the solar array's single-axis tracker. He turned and saw that Zin was still beside him, his fur pressed against his feet. "Are you still a talking dog?" asked Bob. Zin sat up, tilted his head, seemingly questioning Bob. Bob forced a smile. "How was some trip?" "It was a nice break," thought Bob. But nothing had changed, although Zin had never slept at Bob's feet before. That was different. Bob vaguely remembered driving his truck, and he definitely remembered having clothes, but could not find them. Oh well. He and Zin walked the half-mile home. Marla was drinking coffee and reading the morning news from her cell phone. Seeing them enter, she didn't seem surprised that Bob was naked. Marla had seen the open trip jar and knew her husband had left the building. But she was surprised to see Zin by Bob's side, and Zin wagging his stubby tail. "Looks like you two had some fun," Marla said. "Mostly," said Bob. "Anyway, while you two were gone, Pedro called. He said the new Zin bottles are ready for tasting." Pedro was the family vineyard's longtime vintner and enologist. Pedro never produced bad bottles. They were drinkable. They had dark cherry and blackberry flavors with a velvety texture and a smooth finish. Bob wished that he could describe the Zin as bold and full-bodied, but it could better be described as shy and thin. It went down easily enough, but then you quickly forgot it. Perhaps that's why Bob's remaining customers remained brand loyal. They kept forgetting how forgettable the Zin really was. And so Bob expected that this year's vintage would be no better or worse than the 100 previous years. Pedro had not changed any formulations. The year's temperatures and moisture had been about the same. The soil chemistry and organic fertilizers were also about the same. The only thing that had changed in 2 years was that the entire vineyard operations had been powered by solar panels. Bob thought about what Zin had said to him during his trip. "The solar and the vines are one." Something like that. Bob shook his head. The trip was over, back to reality. He went upstairs to shower and put on clothes. All was well, all was the same, except, stepping out of the shower, Zin was waiting for him on all fours, like he was waiting to go somewhere. That had never happened before. Never. Whatever happened on their trip together, it had helped Zin to get closer to him, and that was good. Okay, let's go taste some wine," Bob said to Zin. Zin wagged his stubby tail, excited, eager, and happy. That had never happened before either. Bob walked briskly to the wine cellar building, Zin the Great following him all the way. But where were the new bottles? In answer, Zin the Great walked straight to the rack, still wagging his stub tail and pacing excitedly. It was as if Zin was saying, "Taste it, Bob, taste it." Bob pulled the corkscrew from off the wall and sunk it into the top of the new Zin bottle. The corkscrew's sharp tip entered and twisted into the soft cork. When the corkscrew's lip kissed the bottleneck's top, Bob pushed down on the twin levers. The cork rose and exited the bottle without a pop or a crumb tearing off the cork's body. Zin sat. "Remain calm," he seemed to say. Bob nodded and set the bottle down on Pedro's desk, allowing the new wine to taste oxygen for the first time and breathe. But Bob still had the cork in his hand. Its dark red tip seeped in the new untasted Zin. He brought the cork to his nose and spontaneously said, "Holy shit!" The cork's wine-soaked aroma had burst into his nose like a ray of Zinfandel-infused sunshine. Zin the Great stood up on all four paws. Bob offered his wet nose a whiff of the cork. As Zin's nose touched the cork, Zin the Great's stubby tail wagged like a tail that was 18 inches long and whipping up and down, back and forth. Normally, Bob would allow the bottle to oxygenate for 30 minutes before pouring a full glass, but he felt so much energy from the cork scent that he could only wait 15 minutes. He hunted down a cheap aerator inside Pedro's desk and poured the Zin into an empty glass. Although the wine cellar was windowless, the liquid's bright, ruby-red color seemed to dazzle with effervescent sunlight. Next, Bob dipped his nose into the bell-shaped glass and inhaled. He imagined flowers and honeybees. When Bob's taste buds finally touched his solar-infused Zinfandel, the sensation of perfectly warm spring air radiated into his entire body. Bob didn't just taste sweetness, he felt sweetness. Like his trip jar, his Zinfandel had become a relaxing summer vacation in a glass. Zin wagged his tail, and his front paws jumped up and down. "Yes," Zin seemed to say. "Yes, it's a great Zinfandel. It's bold and full-bodied and more. It's sunshine in a bottle, Bob. Enjoy, enjoy." Bob opened more bottles and walked home with Zin the Great. Walking inside the kitchen, Marla looked up and put down her cell phone. Something had changed. Something was new. Without a word, Bob poured her a glass. She inhaled and then took a sip. The warm feeling was immediate. Marla sensed the love and sun-drenched optimism that seemed to flow out of the wine. She looked at Bob. With the second sip, she felt the kiss of their wedding day, the passion of their wedding night, and the certainty that Bob is and always would be the love of her life. From then on, the label would show rows of solar panels planted on a hill above the vines and an illustration of Zin the Great standing in the corner. They changed nothing else, but word of mouth spread quickly. Stories began to spread throughout the valley and beyond. It was said that after drinking a glass of the great Zin on site, the solar panel would listen to people's worries and offer soothing advice. But the most common review was that the wine made people feel light, not light-headed. They meant that they knew how it meant to be sunshine, to be photons, always warm, always brilliant, always having energy. Bob never heard Zin the Great speak again, but that was okay. They spent so much time together that they didn't need words or solar panels to communicate anymore. Every night that Zin the Great curled his doggy body into a circle and fell asleep at Bob's feet, Bob knew that all was well and that his wine bottle was full again. As for Zin the Great, he never missed a frisbee catch again, and he always enjoyed one of Bob's butt scratches. How was that? Feeling like adopting a dog or even enjoying a glass of solar-infused wine? Maybe a glass of wine will give you that lightheaded feeling. I'm being punny, but the reality is that solar energy is increasingly part of many vineyard operations today, especially in California. You might think that vineyards have low electricity costs, but it's not just growing vines with sun and rain. Vineyard irrigation systems use lots of energy. Many also have wine processing and bottling operations on site. Plus, they have refrigeration for preserving grapes and other harvested crops. Sonoma Vineyards can also have tourist resorts with air-conditioned hotels, spas, and restaurants. It all adds up to high electricity costs. And solar and energy storage systems can provide vineyard owners with significant savings. Of course, building a solar plant does mean giving up acres that might be used for agriculture. But lower electricity costs and a lower carbon footprint can more than make up for the losses. I'm sure any vineyard owners listening to this would weigh the pros and cons, solar tax credits, and financing options. Check the show notes for links to some solar-powered vines and to see if you can taste the light. Of course, please do drink responsibly. As for how I came up with the story, no, I did not write it during an LSD trip. But I do like wine, and I do laugh when I read some ridiculous taste descriptions on bottles. I mean, if you can taste stone, sandalwood, and tar, I bet you can taste infused solar power. So when I thought about that, somehow that led to the idea of talking solar panels, a lost vineyard owner, a lost puppy dog, and a funny LSD trip to tie them all together. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to give a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The algorithms sure do love your reviews, and it helps to spread the word to other podcast listeners. That's it for this week. Next week's story is going to be another solar noir piece. It's a solar drone murder mystery that starts with a gunshot. Bob, the Dog, and the Solar Vineyard was written and read by Tor Solar Fred Valenza. Probably True Solar Stories is a production of Unthink Solar, PR, and Communications. Be bold for solar, stand out, and educate. See you next week.